Well, hey, Merry Christmas!
The beat is things I did 20 years ago. What I did 20 years ago is what they're doing tomorrow.
Alright, so we're cranking right along. We're on episode 4. This episode's going to be about building the amp rack that I built for this truck. Now, the amp rack I built was designed in such a way, because I'm a nut, that's just how I do things, but I didn't want to drill any holes in the truck to mount this thing, and I wanted to be able to take it out and stick it in another truck, just like everything else, like the glove box I built. So what we did on this one is I was able to use all the factory mounting holes on the truck for the back firewall. There was some speaker mounting points there. There was some upholstery mounting points. There was also the jump seat mounting points I used. And so let's get right to it. Alright, so as far as the design of this thing goes, I wanted to keep it kind of looking like it belonged to the truck. The truck's got kind of a rounded off dashboard in that year, but the rest of the truck is pretty angular. I mean, the truck looks like it's made of straight lines, even though there's not really a straight line on it. So I kind of wanted to do the same thing with the amp mount and the subwoofer enclosures. The speaker pods I ended up making totally round because they just fit the speakers better, and I was trying to make them small enough to not obstruct my view through the quarter windows or the rear window. So those ended up being rounded, but I wanted to keep everything angular, so everything on this build is trapezoids and triangles and things like that. There's no squares, but there's trapezoids, there's triangles, there's straight lines everywhere, but I try not to make too many parallel lines, so we'll see how you like it when it's done. So I went ahead and removed the interior and the back of the car. I took the carpets out of the vehicle, so I just had the front seat so I could continue driving it. But once I removed the jump seats, I decided I was going to use the area where the jump seat stores into the body to kind of build the speaker enclosures into for the subwoofers. And in order to mount an amplifier rack where I could put both my amps and my capacitor and some other small components, I decided I would use the 4 mounting holes on either side for the jump seats, because those are really structural mounting points, so I could bolt these the amp rack into it, and even if it had some weight to it, it wasn't going to move around. So that was the plan there, and that's what we ended up doing. So first things first, I made a couple of strips of wood. Well, that's not a good way to put it. I put down some wood strips to level everything out, and then put a block of wood across it to make a foot and a pad on either end to bolt into the jump seat mounting holes. Once I had that pad, I built stands off of it, and then made my main flat sheet. At this point, I just left the sheet square just to fit in the truck, and then I started designing it from there.
I really wanna be like James Brown.
The beat is things I did 20 years ago. What I did 20 years ago is what they're doing tomorrow.
Now this is kind of how I operate. Is I tend to see everything up here. I don't really write a lot of stuff down, as far as I don't draw out plans. I'm not an artist at all. I wish I was, but I can't draw very well. The closest thing I can do to drawing is, I'm okay with flames, but that's about it. And I drew this woodpecker head, but I'm not an artist by any stretch. So for me, I'm not like a Chip Foose or something where I'm going to draw a picture of the car and show you what it's going to look like before I even start on it. I have to keep it all up in here, and I design it kind of not so much as I go. I adjust it and finalize things as I go, but I kind of pictured what I wanted in my head right from the beginning. So I wanted it to be a flat panel where I could lay all my amps into. It was going to have a cover over it that would have a window in it, which is why I went ahead and filled it with LED lighting. And I wanted the subwoofers to use those empty pockets where the jump seats used to be, so that I wasn't taking up the entirety of the back of the truck. I wanted to still be able to put some groceries on top of this amp rack if I wanted to, things like that. It was my daily driver. Once I had the flat panel laid out, you can see I put these 2 boards down, and those boards just represented how thick the amp rack was going to be. Okay, we're just setting this in here as a temporary shelf, because this is where the cover's going to sit. So we're going to build our speaker boxes on top of this cover, as well as the rest of the back wall cover, so that'll leave a channel to slide the cover into. You'll see when it's done. I measured up how tall the amps were, how much space I was going to need under there, and use the minimum amount of space that I could and still have airflow across the amps. So started with that, put those two boards in there, and that was just so I could line up where I was going to build the subwoofer enclosures and come up with the back wall cover, which is one of the first things I did, was the cover for the rear wall. Hopefully this is nice and square, and it is. So we'll go ahead and take some measurements and start building our speaker enclosures. Okay, so I guess we're on to the subwoofer enclosures. So as far as the subwoofer enclosures are concerned, I wanted to maintain that trapezoidal look, the no squares, but everything in straight lines. And so I came up with a design that basically pointed the subwoofers at either the passenger side subwoofer pointed at the driver side driver, and the driver side subwoofer pointed at the passenger's head. So everything I had pointed towards the people sitting in the vehicle. So I know it doesn't matter so much with subwoofers because bass travels no matter where it's pointed. It's much more important on the separates, which you'll see in a minute. But I wanted to do it anyway, just from a look standpoint, and I wanted to see the subwoofers because, you know, they're good-looking subwoofers, and I wanted people to know they were in there. Kind of a show car mentality as far as that goes. So using those stands I made before, I went ahead and built the subwoofer enclosures. Alright, so here's all the components to make the speaker boxes. I believe that's everything. I already got the backs and the front screwed together. Got the pockets for the subs. These fit into the little kick panel areas. Get that all cleaned up. These are rough cuts. Speaker mounts, and then here's all the other panels. So there you go, two of each, ready to go. Now initially, I just made the subwoofer enclosures in such a way that I just cut a small hole in the back for the speaker to clear, for the magnet on the subwoofer to clear, but that was a temporary hole. I decided later, after I read the specs on the woofers, I needed more interior volume, so I ended up making bigger enclosures, or a bigger box on the back of the enclosure to take up more of that jump seat space. God, I can't talk today. Guess it's like every other day. And did that, and like I said, you can see in some of these photos, it had the small little box on the back of it, and later I ended up putting a bigger box. So what I did was, I built the box first and ran it the size I wanted to maximize the space behind where the jump seats used to be. Once that was done, in order to open up that smaller hole to match it and make it look nice, it would have been ideal to use a router with I think they call it a flushing bit, but I didn't own a router at that time, but I did have a benchtop drill press. So what I did was I took the drill press and I clamped a piece of MDF to it, a flat piece of wood, to make a work surface, and then what I did was I chucked the router bit into the drill press. So instead of having a stationary object that I'm routing and moving the router around, I just had a stationary router bit and I moved the box around and slid it around on that flat surface. So it stayed flat the whole time I was routering it, and you can see in these photos that's what I did. I was able to flush up that edge, take it out, and route it all down and make it clean inside, doing it that way. Sometimes you got to be creative if you don't have the exact right tool, and so that's what we did there in order to facilitate not having a router. So you can do that too. If you have a drill press and no router, you can route things the way I did there. So once that was all done and the box was all cleaned up, I went ahead and glued and screwed everything, got it all put together. I used plenty of screws, in case you're wondering. Look at the back there, it's kind of ridiculous, but I wanted to make sure those things stayed together when they were taking a real pounding. And then I mounted them in the truck, and you can see what they're going to look like with the speakers in them. Now, I went ahead and hit all the fasteners on this thing except for the screws on the subwoofer itself. And so the way you accessed all these mounting screws was you took the subwoofer off, pulled it out, and then there were two bolts I had going into the stands at the bottom mounted on the amp rack. Those were the strongest mounts. Those had nuts and bolts, and they bolted in really nice and tight. I used, they make like a metal thing you can pound into wood that has threads in it, and then you can screw things into it that way. So I used those. I forget what they're called, I'm sorry. And that was the tightest. That was almost enough to hold them securely, but I also drilled holes into the back of the subwoofer boxes and used the factory speaker mounting holes that were already built into the firewall. So I was able to put two smaller bolts in there So once I cinched that down, I had 4 bolts holding it in 2 different directions, and that was actually enough to keep them from moving around or rattling or making any noise, because I cranked them all the way up and then they didn't rattle at all. So that's how I did that, and that's how I was able to not drill any holes in the truck. I also sandwiched that upholstery board that goes across the back, that flat piece of wood that makes up the new upholstery for the firewall. That had holes through it so that the amp, that had holes in it so that the speaker box that I was bolting down, the subwoofer box I should say, went through the holes in that back panel and sandwiched that all together so the back panel wouldn't move either. Another thing you want to consider though is you got to leave room about 1/16 of an inch for everywhere you're going to put upholstery. So I did that. I mean, you can't tell from the video, but I had to make everything 1/16 of an inch off of extra space so that when I wrapped everything in upholstery it would still bolt in and line up the way it's supposed to. So anyway, so once I got that laid out, then I started actually building the rack itself. So here we go. What I did was I took a pencil and some straight edges and I started drawing the shape of the rack out and determining by laying the amps in there where all the wiring was going to go. Because I was going to put all the wiring under the rack so that only the amps and the capacitor were showing on top of the rack, and then all the wires would drop out nicely through holes in the rack. So I laid all those holes out, laid out how the rack was going to look from a shape standpoint, and then I went ahead and started cutting it. Alright, so once I got everything laid out, marked out, and started drilling my holes and making my cuts, this is kind of where we ended up. Alright, here we are. I got the amp tray basically done. I'm kind of proud of how it turned out, so I thought I'd make a quick video to just document it all. I don't know how much of this anyone's going to see or hear, but I'm going to blab and show it to you anyway. Yeah, it's not laundry, that's a rag, by the way. Underwear makes a great rag for wood glue. Anyway, and at this point, I went ahead, you'll see in one of these videos where it looks like I'm lovingly and gingerly touching the thing. It's just that I'm showing that I had sanded all the square edges off, got rid of all the sharp edges, and rounded everything. I didn't own a router at this point, so I did that all by hand, just sanded it. So got those holes nice and clean, because you don't want your wires catching on anything sharp. They could end up wearing through the plastic coating, and you know, it's not pro. So rounded everything off so it would look clean and good. Got everything glued and screwed. Everything was screwed together and wood glued. You can see in some of these shots the little bottle of Tight Bond wood glue in the background. So that's the stuff I used. I didn't want any rattles, I didn't want anything coming loose, and I wanted to make sure everything was fastened well. Screws alone won't do it, because MDF screws don't stay in them that long. They will loosen up after time, and glue alone won't do it, because you can't, if you do it with just glue, you end up having to use a bunch of clamps, and it takes forever because you got to wait for the glue to dry, whereas if you're using screws, you can screw it together with the glue in there, and it can dry, you know, overnight while you're doing other things. So everything was glued and screwed. And then once I had the final shape on this amp rack and I had all the holes drilled and everything, I went ahead and painted it black, just nothing special, black. This wasn't something you were going to see much of. It was, like I said, there was going to be a cover going over the top. There would be some lighting in there, but you know, your eyes are going to be drawn toward the amps, not to the black, you know, floor they're sitting on. So I used pretty much just a gloss black on the bottom because it didn't really matter, and then on the top I used a semi-gloss black, so it would look kind of nice and clean. And then what you will notice on this rack is I put 2 trapezoidal shaped pieces of wood on top of the corners of the rack, and those are going to be the supports for the subwoofer enclosures. Those are not bolted down, I mean those aren't glued in, those are just screwed down, because I wanted to be able to remove those to gain access to the amps a little better. The mounting screws for the amps were underneath there, and while I could have reached in with a really short stubby screwdriver to do it, I decided it'd be easier to just be able to take those panels off if I needed access. So I just used really long screws and screwed those down. Now, once I had all that done, it's time to do the wiring. So on the wiring, what I've learned over doing audio and being in bands and playing through instruments and everything else over the years is that you can get feedback and noise by running your power leads too close to your signal leads. Signal leads meaning the sound coming from your instrument in a band's case, or in this case it would be the sound signals coming from the speaker wires to the speakers, the sound signal coming from the head unit to the amp. You know, everything that's sending the sound needs to be kept away from anything that's just sending power. So your power cables, need to be routed away from your speaker cables, is what I'm trying to say. So what I did on the bottom of this thing was I wired everything in such a way as I didn't have any wires crossing over each other. And I did that on purpose to try and retain sound quality and keep noise down and buzzing and stuff like that. So anyway, here's the bottom of the amp rack. You can see what I did there. So it looks a little chaotic on the bottom of the rack, but again, that stuff's all underneath where no one's going to see it, and it gave me a nice clean sound doing it that way. So now we have the wiring done. Another thing I did, and you'll see in some of these photos, I should have mentioned it earlier, but I'll just show you again. I put cooling fans in one end of the rack, and the reason I did that was because once I put the cover on it, I knew I was going to need airflow to keep the amps from overheating. So the way this was designed, there was enough of a gap at either end to go around the amp rack through where the jump seats were, and then access air underneath by the floor. And so it would just pull it in from one side of the floor, run across the amp rack, and then blow it out the other side under the floor, and it was just going to come out. I left a little small gap under the front cover that I was going to build. I don't think I ever ended up building it, but I was going to leave about a 1-inch gap under there over between the carpet and the face of the amp rack, and that was in order to facilitate that airflow. Alright, so that's about it for the amp racks, except I got a few more pictures and maybe some video, I think just pictures, that I can show you of the finished product and the pseudo-finished product. Like I said in my last video, I install everything and make sure it's functionally correct and working the way it's supposed to before I ever finish or paint or do any of that stuff. So you're going to see the sub enclosures sitting on top of the amp rack. The amp rack was painted, but the sub enclosures are just bare wood. The rear wall is just bare wood. When we get to the speaker pods in just a minute, you're going to see those are bare a lot of the time. But what I ended up doing on this amp rack, and I'm just going to tell you while I'm showing you some photos, is we ended up putting a faux leather over both the speaker or the subwoofer enclosures and on the back wall that was going to match the upholstery I was going to use for the door panels as well. And that also ended up being a pretty good match to the seats. Alright, so it looks like we ran out of time to get the speaker pods into this episode. I'm trying to keep them down around the 15-minute mark, 17 at the most, 18 maybe. And, the speaker pods themselves, I've got a lot of video footage for that, so that's going to be a decent episode all by itself. So I'm sorry, but we'll go ahead and postpone that, and we'll make that episode 5 instead of the engine compartment, and then we'll make the engine compartment episode 6. So, hey, I'll get better at this, I promise. So anyway, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you maybe got some inspiration from this one. Definitely a good example of the kind of thing I like to do. And it was the first time I'd ever done anything like that, which is always what I want to do the most. You're going to find on this channel as time goes on, the things that I want to get into the most and the things I'm most passionate about are the things I've never done before. I love learning new things. So join me on that journey, won't you? But anyway, thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. You guys take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in the next episode.
The beat as things I did 20 years ago. What I did 20 years ago is what they're doing tomorrow.